I was reading in Romans chapter 11 this week, and it reminded me of something that was said about John D Rockefeller. You probably know a little bit about that name, but if not, let me remind you. He was president of the Standard Oil Company, and at one point, his company controlled 90% of oil production in the United States. And he was often asked what the secret to becoming a billionaire was. And there's 3 points. If you haven't written them down, I'll share them with you. And you also can be a billionaire. First of all, he said, go to work early. Secondly, stay at work late. Thirdly, find oil. The Apostle Paul talked about another kind of riches, and I was reading in Romans chapter 11, 33 through 36. This is a kind of summary section in Paul's letter where he's recapping what he's said in the first 9 verses and pointing to a conclusion he's going to make toward the end of his letter. But here's what he writes in verses 33 through 36. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who became his counselor? Or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever and ever. You may recognize the word mystery in Paul's writings. Do you remember what Paul said the mystery was? Christ in you. And who was he writing to? Gentiles. That was a mystery and a surprise that even the Gentiles could be included in the plan of God. And Paul speaks about this indirectly here. He will speak about it more directly later. But in his topic, he's talking about the riches of God. Obviously, this is a different kind of wealth than John D. Rockefeller was concerned with. Jesus and God's wealth cannot be measured in the same way as earthly wealth. All creation is his. Try to give an estimate on the value of all creation. We were told today that in Larry's lesson that there are trillions of stars. What's the value of one of them? So his wisdom, his knowledge, his creation are part of his riches that we enjoy, but we don't necessarily understand all that is part of them. Some may have wondered, with all these riches that are available to God, how the lost condition of Israel could result. This was a discussion in the first part of the letter of Romans. How has it turned out that the nation of Israel has become so lost in general in view of the riches of God? Was it a failure of God? No, his riches are unlimited. His availability to deal with a situation is unlimited. Perhaps it instead has to do with the phrase, who has known the mind of God? Who has become his counselor? What did God do in using the lostness of Israel that no one could ever have imagined before it was revealed? What's amazing about the riches of God is that a remnant of Israel will be saved by God's grace. And more amazing is that because of Israel's general unfaithfulness, Gentiles had an opportunity to be saved by grace. This is a strange thing about God's plan, his wisdom, and his way of doing things. We might not have done it that way. We might not have seen it as they certainly did not as it was unfolding for them in the time of Paul. Grace came to the Gentiles. Here's how Paul explained it in Romans chapter 11, verses 11 through 12. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Speaking of Israel. May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. And this was to make Israel jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So Paul is just amazed at how God has worked. So often in Paul's life, it didn't seem that the will of God was going to work out. He was moved here and moved there and denied here. And we as Gentiles are the silent beneficiary of the riches of God in his long-term plan to save mankind. What may have seemed to some to be a failure of God was really the riches of his wisdom in action. Perhaps another question may come to our minds. Which of God's riches are available to us? Certainly a part of the riches of creation are available to us. From the sunset we see to the food that we eat, we enjoy God's creation. And so we can take the idea of the riches of God and realize that there are many ways that we are blessed with his riches. And part of the riches that Paul is pointing to is God's knowledge. Larry's lesson this morning was essentially dealing with that subject. We received the riches of his knowledge. Larry spoke about many examples of how we can benefit and gain that richness and how it will be effective in our lives long range. But it's possible to see the knowledge of God being discovered even by those who don't necessarily recognize him. When a scientist discovers some principle that's true about creation, about the universe, this is something that God had a part in making and allowing him to discover it and share that mystery with us. But what about God's wisdom? This was perhaps knowledge and wisdom were perhaps two of the things that were part of Larry's lesson today. And of course, I didn't know Larry was going to talk about them. So I will not include that in my lesson because if you didn't see his lesson, it's going to be online. So look at it. How can we find access to God's perfect judgments? How can we find God's wisdom in our time? How can that part of his richness be ours? I think it begins with listening. This is how access to wisdom generally begins. He listens to us, which is the amazing part. We come to him with our needs and he listens. Remember when Daniel was confessing his sin and the sins of the nation of Israel in Daniel chapter 9? Daniel prays to God for forgiveness and help. Let's read what Daniel says there in verse 18 and following. "O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations in the city which is called by your name. For we are not presenting our supplications for you on account of any merits of our own, but on account of your great compassion. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and take action. For your own sake, O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people are called by your name." Daniel recognized an important truth. First of all, God listens to us. That's part of his richness towards us. He listens to us. And so he pleads to God to listen and to take action, to not delay, because the city of his people are in disarray. But in verse 20, he goes on, "Now, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people of Israel and presenting my supplication before the Lord, my God, in behalf of the holy mountain of God, before the Lord, my God, in behalf of the holy mountain of God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of evening offering. He gave me instruction and he talked with me and he said, 'O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision.'" This is the second part of listening. God listens to us, and then he tells us. He reveals. In this particular case, Daniel gets a message directly from God through through Gabriel, a message, a vision that he needs to understand. He needs to listen to God. So when it comes to listening and gaining the riches of God, he listens and we listen. Daniel pleaded in verse 19 that God would listen to him, and God did. Because in verse 21, Gabriel is sent with God's answer. I read the story about a woman named Dinah Smith in Oklahoma. And she was telling about her small daughter, and they were in a department store looking at dolls. And she was pointing out the various dolls to her daughter, and her daughter would say, well, what does it do? Asking about each one. And the mother would answer, well, this one talks, and this one wets, and this one cries. But the dolls were really expensive, and the mother was really kind of hesitant not to stir up her interest in some of these pretty active dolls, because there were some plain dolls that were a lot cheaper. And she came to one particular ordinary doll, and the daughter said, well, does it do anything? And Dinah said, yes, it listens. And the daughter, and she took it, okay? Why is it that listening is so important to us? We all need someone to listen to us. When no one else cares, or when no one else has time, or when no one else can be trusted, God listens. We always need that listener. But he not only listens, he answers. And when he answers, then we have an opportunity to listen to him. In Matthew 17, verse 5, we have recorded the day that John baptized Jesus. You remember a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice out of the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Sometimes God's not subtle, is he? He comes right out over and over and says, listen to me. Listen to him. Later, Peter spoke about the importance of listening to Jesus. And this connects back to the nation of Israel. In Acts chapter 3, verse 22 through 23, he quotes from Deuteronomy 18. Moses said, the Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. To him you shall give heed to everything he says to you. And it will be that every soul that does not heed the prophet shall be utterly destroyed from among the people. And so God gave his nation warning after warning. The Messiah would come. John the Baptist would come. And God is pointing to his son and to John the Baptist and saying, listen to them. And here in this section from Deuteronomy, those who do not heed the words of John the Baptist and the one that he was pointing to, Jesus, will be utterly destroyed from among the people. So prayer is important in the life of the Christian. The opportunity that we have to speak to God, and he listens. And when he listens, he answers our prayer. And in this process, we discover the riches of God because he shares them with us. The Apostle Paul knew these truths through his own experience. He saw that God not only listened to him, but also that God would lead him if he was willing to follow. If Paul started for one location and ended up in another, he trusted that was where God meant for him to be. This is what Paul learned when he had an open door to the gospel in Troas. He wanted to go somewhere else. He wanted to go on to Macedonia out of concern for Titus, but he could have stayed in Troas and taught the gospel, and yet he didn't. And so he has to do, perhaps more than we know in the text, he has to make a decision. Does he stay or leave somebody to carry out this ministry and go find Titus to find out what's going on in Corinth, or does he go on to Macedonia? Well, we find out in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, that he goes on to Macedonia. He is so concerned about the church in Corinth that he is not at peace to stay in Troas and preach the gospel. There were others there who could do that. But he went on to Macedonia. The plans seemed a little bit confused. Perhaps from our perspective, things weren't going the way that Paul would have hoped them to be. But he concludes in verse 14, but thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumph, and through us spreads the fragrance of the knowledge of him everywhere. God, if we're following his will, and if we're allowing him to intervene and lead us according to his will bring triumph. And the message of his son, the fragrance will spread everywhere. Paul had some more obvious experiences in this area. He was in Acts chapter 16 traveling in Asia, what we know today as Turkey. And he was trying to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not permit him to go there. Instead, in verse 10, Paul concluded that God wanted him to go to Macedonia. So here were two different situations. Both of them ended up with him in Macedonia. There was also the time that Paul was given what he was called a thorn in the flesh. This was some reoccurring problem that Paul had, some difficulty, most likely in his flesh, since that's what it's called. He received it, Paul tells us, in order to keep from exalting himself. How had Paul become in a position where he might have exalted himself? He went into heaven and saw things and heard things that no one was allowed normally to do. And this perhaps could have caused him to have some kind of pride and interfered in his ministry. And he finds out in his discussion with God that he received this thorn in the flesh, and God was not going to take it away. He received it in order to keep himself humble. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, 8-9, we see Paul's prayer to God about this thorn in the flesh. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, Paul says, I will rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Sometimes we don't know exactly what God's will is going to be. We have our preference. We would like this to happen or that to happen. Something's very, very important to us in some way, and then it doesn't. And the challenge comes to us. Does this mean God didn't listen? Does this mean God didn't answer? Paul's request to have the problem taken away probably caused him some anguish at first, because he asked 3 times, and God said no. And the reason was he had something better for Paul, and Paul discovered this. We may also pray for things fervently, believing that we cannot do God's will until he answers this particular prayer. But that's assuming we know what God knows, and we don't. God knows out there something that is more important either to us specifically or to the accomplishment of his will. And so Paul began to learn this in some of these confusing situations. It didn't turn out the way he wanted. And then suddenly he has a plan to do this, and God says, no, you can't do that. He's suffering from a physical problem, and he asks for God's help in recovering from that. And God says, no, you need this for a reason greater than simply your comfort. And this is a challenge then that we deal with when we're talking about the riches of God. His knowledge, his wisdom is so much beyond our ability to grasp that we learn basically to trust him when his way doesn't seem the best way to us, when God's answer is not what we planned. And we have a tendency to be discouraged. We may find out later that what God did really turned out to be the best thing. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, a principle that helps us in these circumstances. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Some of God's greatest gifts are what we thought were unanswered prayers. It was just the answer that he knew we needed. Amazingly, he's able to lead us without violating our free will. And nothing shows us the patience of God more than he allows us to make our own decisions. Sometimes, left to our wisdom, we can make serious mistakes, and yet God grants us that freedom. And perhaps from that we can learn to trust in him. Clearly, his preference is for us to ask him for help. In James chapter 4, verses 2-3, The brother of Jesus says, you do not have because you do not ask. That's one kind of problem. Number two in that problem is he says, you ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives. God's plan for us, or his desire for us, is that we ask for his help, that we come in contact with the great riches of his wisdom in order for us to do what is best for us and for the will of God. And he finally says, you ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives. So here's an opportunity for us to consider how diligently do we seek God's wisdom, his riches, and how willing are we to follow them when we receive them. God's leading will not ever be into sin. So we can find clear instructions about our requests in 1 John chapter 5, 14 through 15. This is the confidence which we have before him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have the requests which we have asked from him. The interesting thing is, it may not be exactly what we asked, but it will be what he knows is best. And so we see the glory of his care, his willingness to listen, his willingness to lead, if we are willing to listen and to follow. But probably the most important thing of his riches that we are blessed by is his love. That's really the conclusion in many situations and in many passages. Love is the thing that binds us when we're falling apart. He listens and he leads because, first of all, he loves us. That's the message in John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. I read about a man named Bob Weber, past president of Kiwanis International. And he had spoken to a club in a small town and was spending the night with a farmer in the community there. And he had just sat down to relax on the porch when the newspaper boy came by and delivered the evening newspaper. And the boy noticed a sign, puppies for sale. And so he got off his bike and he said to the farmer, how much do you want for the pups, mister? And the farmer said $25. Of course, today that would be a bargain, but at the time that he wrote that, that was a lot, especially for a paper boy. And so the boy's face dropped. Well, sir, could I at least see them? This is what you never should do, right? Don't look. You know, when I was trying to buy a car, the people at Toyota said, we'll drive it home tonight. I'm thinking, they're letting me drive this car home and I don't own it. They know something that we sometimes don't. But anyway, the farmer whistled and Mama came around the corner, and following were 4 of the cutest puppies that anyone had ever seen, wagging their tails. And at last another puppy, number 5, came around the house and he was dragging his rear legs. What's the matter with that puppy, mister? The boy asked. Well, son, that puppy is disabled. We took him to the vet and the doctor x-rayed him and he doesn't have a hip joint. And so his leg will never be right. And to the amazement of both men, the boy dropped his bike. He reached for his collection bag and he took out 50 cents. And he said, I'll pay 50 cents a week until I've paid the $25. Can I have that pup? And the farmer replied, but son, you don't seem to understand. He'll never be able to run or jump. He's going to be disabled forever. Why in the world would you want such a useless pup as that? And so the boy paused for a moment and he reached down and he pulled up his leg, the pant on his leg. And he revealed that there was an iron brace and that there were leather straps twisted around his leg. And the boy said, mister, that pup is going to need someone who understands him in this life. The Hebrew writer says that we have such a friend, one who understands us. But even more amazing is his love. Paul writes in Romans 5, verse 8, but God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Even though God is holy, he is willing to give his son for unholy humanity. He had a mystery throughout all the ages. The mystery would be that we could be saved through the Messiah by his sacrifice. That was unheard of among the nation of Israel. They couldn't have believed it, and they had difficulty accepting it. Peter had to see a vision 3 times to be moved to share the gospel with a Roman soldier. Even though God is holy and we are unholy, He's given His Son to take away our sin. And more important than dying for us is that He lives for us. He is our friend. He's our advocate. He's the one that stands between us and the accusations of Satan. He's our shepherd. And the scripture says He's our rock. Ian Pitt Watson described God's love toward us as illogical love. Have you ever thought about that? That God's love is illogical? Well, based on the logic of the farmer, that boy's love was illogical, right? It's an interesting thing to think of. He told the love that his little girl had for her rag doll, even when it was more rag than doll. It was her rag doll that helped him to see God's illogical love for us. Watson said this: some things are loved because they're valuable, but some things are valuable because they're loved. And that's us. Anyone on the street might look at us and not think much of us, but God sees us differently. We're valuable because He loves us. And that's evident by what His Son did for us. So it is then that God's love might be described as illogical. We are truly His rag dolls. And we are valuable only because He loves us. It's no wonder Paul's heart overflowed with praise in this section of Romans concerning the riches of God. He had found his way into the very vault of God's boundless wealth and began to see how it had all worked together. When he could not understand it, when he was out there persecuting Jews who had turned to Jesus, he had no idea. He wasn't able to see the wisdom of God. But he listened, and God showed him, and he preached it. And through the generations, that message has come to us, and we enjoy the riches of God. There's no other way to receive them except through His gift, His giving, and His Son, Jesus. So we've discovered a God who listens and who leads, and most of all, who loves us. And this is our hope and what we can share with those around us. If we can encourage you today in some way, we're going to sing a song of invitation. We invite you. If you'd like to know how to obey the gospel, what that means, we'd like to share that with you. But if you have some other request of the church here, something you'd like to share, please come while we stand and while we sing.